Today we're going to be talking about core mechanics. Now in my last video we talked about foundational goals, which is the essential first step before you start thinking about your core mechanics. If you haven't seen that video, boom. Hopefully you got that right this time. First thing I need to talk about is the difference between your core mechanics and your non-core mechanics. Core mechanics are the part of the game that the game could not exist without, that it would not be a game, it would not operate. Everything else is non-core. Now, there are subjective judgments as to what counts as core and what doesn't, and some functions of a game are going to be extremely simple, but the absolute beating heart of core mechanic in a miniatures war game is the random outcome generator. Classically, this means dice, but it doesn't have to. Let's look at some examples from games you're probably familiar with and talk about what their core mechanics are, especially with regards to their random outcome generator. So in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, in fact for most editions of Dungeons & Dragons that I can recall, the core mechanic is fundamentally the same. Roll a dice, roll a d20 in fact, and score higher than an arbitrary target number. So the classic example is rolling to beat someone's armor class. Okay? That is the core mechanic. Everything else built around that is non-core, it is a bolt-on. If you took that one mechanic out, the game would no longer function, whereas everything else is fundamentally additional to that. Very similarly, in Warhammer 40,000, latest edition and going back as far as I can remember, the core mechanic is roll a d6 and score higher than an arbitrary number. And this mechanic is so core that in the most fundamental dice interaction in the game, that mechanic simply repeats 3 times in a row. Roll to hit, roll above an arbitrary number. Roll to wound, roll above an arbitrary number. Roll to save, roll above an arbitrary number. It's exactly the same mechanic 3 times in a row. It is absolutely core to Warhammer 40,000. You could not remove that mechanic from the game and still have a functional game, whereas everything else is ultimately non-core. Now those two examples are incredibly straightforward, but I don't want to give you the impression that that means that they're bad. A straightforward mechanic is a fantastic idea for games that are intended to be entry level, accessible for people who perhaps haven't encountered this kind of game before, who want to engage with a role play or a miniatures or a tabletop game that they've not played but they want to get into quickly. You want a straightforward mechanic like that, it's going to work. But if, like me, you're designing games for people who are already familiar with this environment, who already know what a miniatures game looks like and how it works, then maybe you want to think about something a bit more sophisticated, complex, nuanced, whatever you want to call it. That doesn't mean that it's better than a straightforward mechanic, it just means it's different. It gives people something different to get their heads around. Really good example is in Corvus Belli's Infinity the Game. Now that initially looks like a straightforward mechanic. Unlike D&D, which is a d20 roll over, Corvus Belli's Infinity is a d20 roll under an arbitrary number. But I would argue that the single roll is not the core mechanic of Infinity. The core mechanic of Infinity is the interaction between that roll and the reaction roll. And the reaction roll is another d20 roll against an arbitrary number. When you pair those two things up, whoever rolls higher without going over the arbitrary number wins. And that's a more complex twist on roll dice arbitrary number combination, and I would say that that was absolutely core to Infinity. A lot of the interactions require a reaction roll. You couldn't really do the game without it. You could just about argue that an arbitrary roll would still provide a working game. It wouldn't be Infinity, but we'll come on to that subjective judgment later of what counts as core and what doesn't. And there is definitely an element of nuance. Now the last example I obviously have to pull out is my own game, Horizon Wars. The family of games all use the same mechanic. You roll a set number of d12s And again, you're trying to achieve an arbitrary score, but in this game, you form your dice into groups, and the number of groups that achieve or beat the arbitrary score are the number of successes that you have. So again, it's built on that basic idea of roll dice arbitrary score, but in this case, you're forming these groups, and that just adds an extra additional layer of complexity that appeals to people who are perhaps more familiar with games than those for whom they're new. Now, as I said, those examples are all looking at your random outcome generator, your ROG. Now, there are other elements to a game that are arguably core. And when you're talking about miniatures game, the obvious example is movement. In a miniatures game, the ability to move around the table is pretty fundamental to having a tactical wargaming experience. So it's certainly arguable that there are non-ROG elements to a game that are also core. Now, I am going to look at those, but not in this episode, because those are what I call the peripheral core. And the peripheral core is stuff that the game wouldn't work without, but at the same time, there's not a lot of nuance generally involved in how they work. And there aren't a lot of them, so the next episode might be quite short. We'll see how much I can build it out. Okay, so we'll look at the peripheral core in the next episode. But if you're thinking about things that aren't random outcome generators, but which you consider to be core to your game, those are the peripheral core. We'll look at that next. For the purposes of this episode, we're just looking at random outcome generators. Now, in the last episode, I talked about how one of the important roles that foundational goals perform is to help you whenever you run up against a decision-making point. And when you're starting to build your core mechanic around a random outcome generator, then starting with your foundational goals is absolutely essential. Now, it may be that you're coming to design a game with a specific random outcome generator already in mind, and you've built that into your foundational goals. You know how it's going to work. You're using a D8 or a D10 or a tarot deck or something else, okay, is your random outcome generator. You've built that into the foundational goals. If you remember last week, I had a fairly vague foundational goal in this field, which was either playing cards or D12s. Playing cards because I'm interested in how to use playing cards in new ways to make miniatures games. D12s because, well, D12s is what Precinct Omega does. So for the purposes of this section, we're going to be eventually looking at playing cards and how I think I can build a mechanic out of playing cards. But the other aspect of my foundational goals that is going to be really important in this episode is the setting. Now, I kind of put the setting to one side last week, which is right, but that doesn't mean I put it away completely, because I am thinking about a fantasy or pseudo-historical game. And that desire for a pre-Black Powder setting, wherever it might be, is linked to my other foundational goal, which was for exciting, engaging, tactical hand-to-hand combat. So all of those things are in my mind when I'm thinking about what kind of random outcome generator I'm going to want to use and what it's going to look like. And the important difference to me between, say, a modern or science fiction game and a pre-Black Powder game is that the interactions between characters in combat become much more important and necessarily much less decisive. So in a sci-fi game, generally speaking, you fire a weapon, it hits your opponent, they're either wounded or they're not. Okay? And that is the end. And that feeds into that feel of bang, bang, bang. You know, I've fired a weapon. That's my interaction, is to pull a trigger and there's an explosion and there's a resolution. Whereas in a pre-Black Powder setting, when we're talking about particularly something with the cinematic qualities that we want out of a tabletop miniatures game, you're thinking about swinging your swords and blocking with shields and using years-long trained martial arts skills in order to achieve an outcome from that combat that could resolve over several minutes on the battlefield. Yeah? And so that implies that what we're going to want are fewer interactions, but each interaction itself is going to be far more complex, whereas in a sci-fi or modern game it would be the other way around. You want relatively simple interactions, but you want to have lots of them. Okay, so here we're looking for low numbers, high complexity. And all of that means that the hand-to-hand resolution mechanic is going to be absolutely fundamental to the game. And it's going to be core. And this is why I'm focusing on this hand-to-hand resolution as my core mechanic. Whatever works, I'm then going to use that mechanic as broadly as I can to resolve other things, but it's got to work for hand-to-hand. It's got to deliver that engaging, exciting, tactical hand-to-hand combat experience. Those are the things I'm looking for. Engaging, exciting, and tactical. So there's got to be some thinking to it. But that also implies that some other things are going to be core. How do characters get into hand-to-hand? That's going to be core. How do they resolve that hand-to-hand? Not just with the mechanics of actual fighting, but what does it look like when it finishes? That's going to be core. Everything else associated with that is going to be non-core rules. So I can put them to one side and we'll come back to them in a couple of weeks. So having established that I want to work for a playing cards mechanic if I can, let's take a moment to think about what's really good about playing cards as a random outcome generator, especially in the context of where we're trying to create a core mechanic that's got some crunch to it. Now, the thing about a dice is that generally speaking, a dice goes from 1 to whatever. Let's say 12 because it's a D12 because it's awesome. So you've got results from 1 to 12. But that's it. You can add 2 dice together or 3 dice or 4 dice and you can get that bell curve function if you're looking for, specific outcomes. But there's really not that much you can do to make dice more complex without having to get into the realm of custom dice. Playing cards, however, come with complexity built in. So first of all, you've got the face value of the card. From 1, let's say, for ace, right up to 13 for a king. At the same time, you've also got those 2 distinct families of cards. You've got the court cards of jack, queen, king, possibly ace or not. And then you've got the number cards from 2 to 10. That's really interesting. Now, secondly, of course, cards come in 2 different colours. We've got red cards and black cards. That's really interesting. Then, of course, there's the suits, clubs, diamonds, hearts and spades. And I'm going to talk later about why suits are particularly interesting. And, of course, jokers as well. Most playing card decks come with at least 2 jokers, sometimes as many as 4. And you can build in jokers as a special feature of the deck. Or you can just remove them and not have them there at all. That's the other thing you can do with playing cards is you can stack the deck in different ways. So, for example, in Infinite Dark, the playing cards are shuffled in 2 halves, so that you shuffle the joker into each of those halves, or a joker into each of the halves, and then put the halves together. That's because the joker acts as a timer, and when the second joker comes out of the deck, that indicates the end of the game. So the players never quite know how long a game is going to be when they get started, so you're always up against an uncertain clock. That's the kind of thing you can do with playing cards you can't do with other random outcome generators. I can't set a number of dice to be sure that they're always going to turn out a certain number of results. It's just not something you can do. The other cool thing that playing cards offers, I don't know if I'm going to go down this path with this game that we're talking about here, but is the tarot. Now, the tarot's got a lot of baggage that goes along with it. Fundamentally, a tarot deck is a relatively modern invention. It's a 20th century invention that draws upon designs of playing card decks that go back to the 14th or 15th century. So one feature of the tarot deck is that the court cards have one more face. So rather than jack, queen, king, ace, they've got jack, knight, queen, king, ace. So you've got one more court card within there, and that plays interestingly with the odds. The other interesting thing about the tarot deck, of course, is the trumps. Now, I say trumps, you might say major arcana. Originally, the major arcana were just a separate suit of cards. They were like a 5th suit that had their own particular way of playing with them. Because if you look even at modern tarot cards, the trump cards have value. They are valued from 1 up to, I can't remember, whatever it is, whatever the highest value is. So they come with their own value and they act as a separate suit. And of course, there's all of that then mystic associations that go along with the modern tarot, all the names of the cards of the Fool and the Magician and the Devil and the Empress and all that kind of stuff, which brings with it an element of mystical magicalness that is very suitable for the kind of fantasy pseudo-historical game that I'm wanting to write. As I say, whether the tarot's going to work for me, I'm not sure, but there's no denying that there is a lot of appeal in, let alone the mathematical qualities, but the aesthetic qualities of using a tarot deck in a miniatures wargame. Okay, so having given you all of that preamble about core mechanics, how I've used my foundational goals to decide on where I'm going to begin in trying to determine some core mechanics, let's make some up. So hopefully I'm going to be able to get a little side picture here that will show you my deck of cards. And now, I've done a lot of pre-work off camera around this, not least of the fact that I've recorded this several times already. I'm having some technical trouble. But really, we're going to go live here. So I've not prepped the hand that we're going to play. And I'm just going to play out 5 cards. And 5 cards basically feels like a good starting place when we're thinking about a hand of playing cards. It could go smaller, could go larger. We're going to start with 5 and just see how it feels. So all I'm doing now is looking at the cards I've dealt myself and feeling how would it feel if I were in a combat. If I had a hand-to-hand combat in my miniature wargame in front of me and this was the hand I was dealt, how would I be expecting to go about it? Well, we can see that I've got a couple of face cards. Ace to me feels high. I think ace is high, feels natural. So that's one thing we're going to take away is aces, initially, they feel like aces are high. Okay, we got a jack. Again, face card looks good. Couple of 10s and a 3. And we've got a nice selection of suits. Got no hearts, got spades, diamonds, clubs, and another spade. So if I'm going to imagine that I'm playing a combat, my first instinct is to go, I'm going to attack with my ace of spades. I'm going to attack strong. I'm going to go in with a big hit. That's my first instinct. Now, the other thing I just did is I just played that down, face up. And that feels natural. I could have placed it face down and said, well, I'm attacking you and you don't know what I'm going to attack with. You've got to decide on your defence. Even that, I'm attacking, you're defending. You're defending. You're playing with me here now, okay? So we're playing an ace of spades. Now, you don't have a hand of cards, so I'm just going to draw another card randomly off the top to see what you're going to defend with. You're going to defend with a queen of spades. Now, ace beats queen. I think that's clear. That's my first. Ace beats. Ace is high. It's higher than the queen. So I attacked with the spade. You defended with the queen. Wasn't enough. But it also, I'm thinking, so I played with the ace, but you guys defended with a queen of spades. If you knew the queen wasn't going to beat the ace, why would you defend with a queen of spades? I'd be expecting if you can't beat the ace, you're going to throw something low away because you know you can't block it. So that would get me thinking, wow, they must, if their lowest card is a queen of spades, I'm up in some trouble. Now, I just pulled a card at random off the deck, which immediately speaks to the solo aspect of the game, that you can pull random cards to see how they go. Okay, so that's something which we're going to put aside. That is non-core. We're going to put that aside and come back to it. So regardless, the ace has beaten the queen. Now, I attacked. You defended with the queen of spades. I won. Now, we could then reverse things and you get to hit me, but I've won. I've beaten you with an ace. I feel like you've taken a wound. So it makes more sense to me if you've taken a wound. In fact, let's bring in some counters here so we can track this. You guys have taken 1 wound, if I can find it. There it is. So you guys have taken 1 wound. I feel like I've still got the initiative here. It's an interesting idea. So I'm going to keep attacking. Because I've attacked you, you failed to block it, so I'm going to follow that up with another attack. So I attack again, this time with my next highest, which is a Jack of Diamonds. And you block with a 7 of Hearts. Not enough. So I've still attacked you. So I've still hit you again. So you've got 2 wounds. So I still have the initiative. And this feels right. I've hit twice, 2 wounds. I mean, if you've been hit twice, you're not going to suddenly be fighting back. So I'm going to come back in. Now, my cards aren't getting as good now. I'm going to come in with a 10 of Diamonds, counter with an 8 of Diamonds. Okay, so I've still won. I've still won. But winning with a 10 doesn't feel as good as winning with an ace. I feel like that should be different. I feel like that should add, you know, the fact that I use my big cards up front, you know, I'm hitting you as hard as I can, but I'm getting weaker. You know, I've gone in big. I don't have as much strength left to cause the wounds that I had before. So now I'm using a number card. It's not going to be a wound. I've won. I've done something, but what have I done? Now, the idea I've got is fatigue. Now, I don't know what fatigue does yet. We'll come to that. But fatigue is in there, okay? So you've got 2 wounds and 1 fatigue from that attack. So I'm not causing you wounds anymore, but I've caused you fatigue. But I won, so I've still got the initiative. So now you attack. Sorry, I attack with the 10, blocking with the 5. It's a 10 again, another point of fatigue. So I haven't got enough strength to cause a wound. My last card, I've still got the initiative. Going to attack with the 3 of clubs. You block with the 6 of spades. Guess what? The 6 beats the 3. We're out of cards, but now you have the initiative. I like that. I like that. Now, I was just pulling random cards, which speaks to the solo element, which is good. Let's look at it again. We'll keep you on 2 wounds and 2 fatigue, which is not great, but we're going to deal you a hand now. Okay? And me. Now, obviously, in practice, we wouldn't see each other's hands. But we can get an idea of where we're going to go with this, all right? So, you've got 2 wounds, 2 fatigue. But you've now got the initiative, so it's your turn to fight back. So you're going to come in strong as well. We've got a great hand here. So you're going to come in strong with the Ace of Spades, Ace of Hearts. Do I want to send my Ace of Clubs in there straight away? I don't know what you've got in the rest of your hand, and the rest of this hand's really weak. You know, you've got 2 wounds, 2 fatigue. Maybe I should save this up. I can afford to take some hits, you know? So I don't know how many face cards you've got. I'm just going to block with my 3 of spades. I'm going to let you take that hit. I'll take a hit now. So you've still got the initiative. You're going to follow up that ace with a king. I'm thinking flip. Okay. Ace and king in a hand of 5. I'm going to take this wound as well. We'll see. I'm going to take this wound. I'm now 2 wounds down. I'm feeling like 3 wounds is kind of average. 3 wounds is kind of, once of 3 wounds, you're probably out of action. You know, you're down. So I've taken 2, and that's not looking great. You're coming back in with another king, and I'm thinking, flip, I can't take another wound. I'm going to block it with the ace. Okay, so I've blocked it, and I've now got the initiative. But my cards aren't that strong, so I'm going back in with a 6. And you're going, ha ha ha. But you need to reclaim the initiative. And you've only got the jack and the 2 left, so you can block the 6. If you block it with the 2, you take another fatigue. That would put you on 3 fatigue. And my thinking is that one use for fatigue could be so many fatigue adds up to a wound. So if you get 3 fatigue, that's an automatic wound. So if you take another fatigue, that will put you on 3 wounds, which will put you down. So you don't want to let me get that fatigue through. So you're going to block it. You block it with your jack. You've got the initiative. You've only got the 2 left. I can block the 2 with the 4. Now I've got the initiative. You're still on 2 wounds, 2 fatigue, but I've taken 2 wounds as well. But now I've got the initiative in the combat. Shall we play one more? We'll play one more hand. Now, one thing I haven't decided is whether we'd be shuffling cards back into the deck, but let's say in this combat we're not going to do that. So I'll deal you a hand, and deal me a hand. So I've got the initiative, but look at that hand, my word, not a single face card in it. I don't know what you've got. I don't know what's in your hand, but I have not got a strong hand. And I can't let you have the initiative. If I can get one more fatigue on you, if you get one more wound on me, I'm in trouble. Where am I going to go? This is where we get into the tactical. Not got a great hand. I'm going to go in strong and hope maybe you haven't got much to show for it. You like your ace, so you're going to block with the king, gain the initiative. You come back with the ace. I've got nothing to protect myself. I block with the 4. I take my 3rd wound, 3 wounds, and I am out. Off. Gone. All because you had, or I had a bad hand. Now that feels a little bit wobbly, doesn't it, having a bad hand? But that's okay. I've got some thoughts about that, and we'll come back to it. Okay, let's put the cards away and review what we've learned. So the first thing I took away from my experiment was that value order was important. You know, higher value cards beat lower value cards. Straight up. Okay, ace is high. Ace felt right to be high, and ace feels good in the hand, so ace is high. So we learned that. The other thing that we took away was that the court cards perform differently to the number cards. What you want are court cards. Court cards are the ones that can wound your opponent. You want to try and avoid using them to block your opponent if you can, because they're your big hits. As you use up your big hits, you lose the ability to wound your opponent. You wear yourself down. You may find yourself with less good cards. Which makes me think about fatigue and the uses of fatigue. Also makes me think about skills and how different heroes could have different skill levels that would allow them to perhaps exchange cards in their hands. But all of this is non-core. It's just getting the brain working. So overall, that core mechanic feels okay. Not sure it's great, but it feels okay. Now, one thing we've not engaged with at all yet is suits. And I'll come back to that. I've got some real big thoughts about suits, but they don't feel like they're core to the game. But they might be. We'll think about it in a minute. So from that experimental playtest, what have we learned? Okay, number value is important. Ace is high, higher cards beat lower cards. That's an important takeaway. It also occurs to me that we've got 13 values. From ace to king or 2 to ace, there are 13 values there. That aligns nearly with 12 sides on a d12. There's nothing core that I feel like I could add, but I'm just going to keep that in the back of my mind that at some point maybe there could be an alignment between the cards and the dice. Don't know, it's just something in the back of my head. But that in itself speaks back to the earlier question about tarot. If we were bringing in tarot and we had 14 cards in a minor suit, minor arcana, because we've added the knight, that doesn't align as well with the d12. So maybe if we're thinking about bringing in a d12 to align with the cards, doesn't align as well with the tarot deck. So the other thing I took away was this idea of initiative. You know, I started with the attack. I'm not sure why I had the initiative, but it felt like I had the initiative. Does initiative mean that I'm always attacking first? Maybe not. Maybe initiative, I might look at my hand and think, well, I don't want to attack first. Maybe I want to defend first. Maybe I want to drain their hands or add on their fatigue or something, that there'll be some tactical aspect where it may not always be advantageous to attack first. Maybe it is. I mean, that's something to think about. I might start the rules saying, the player with initiative can either attack or defend. They decide who attacks first. But it may be that as I play test, I find that you always want to attack first. There is no circumstance under which you would want to defend first. In which case, you can take that away and just go, the initiative player always attacks first, and make it simple. But I don't know that'll need a lot of play testing through. We're not there yet. The other thing I took away was that the attacker plays face up. So they play their card face up. The defender can then judge which card they're going to play to defend. Maybe there could be a skill in which the player can play face down sometimes as an attack. If they've got the initiative, if they're a particular class or quality, or they've got an ability, it means they can play a hidden attack. Could work. We'll see. And after the player plays their attack face up or face down, the defender plays a defense card from their hand. The object of defense, at the moment, you can't damage somebody off offense, you just regain the initiative. But maybe there could be a thing whereby some quality allows a successful defend not only to gain the initiative, but also to impose fatigue or damage, a wound, on the attacker. As you take initiative, you also cause fatigue or a wound. Would feel quite powerful, but yeah, I can see it working. I can see that working. And we can see that initiative switches on a successful defense. So I've blocked your attack, now I have the riposte. And it's got that back and forth. So I'm coming in with multiple blows. As I weaken, I don't have as good an attack. You can block it, and now I'm on the defensive again, you've got me. So that feels like it's got the ebb and flow of a hand-to-hand combat, which is what you might expect. We found this difference between wounds and fatigue. Now, I played that out for you, and I won't pretend that I was making it up as I was going along, but it did evolve that naturally, that I was playing cards when I was experimenting off camera, that I kind of went, just winning with a number card doesn't feel as good as winning with a face card. What's the difference? And it didn't matter whether I was winning with a 6 or with a 10, but it really mattered if I was winning with a jack rather than a 10. And psychologically, I thought that was interesting. And, I've only got me. So I've only got me as my sample audience, but I have to rely on the idea that my gut feeling about how the experience is mine. Now, if you've got a team to work with, you can spread this stuff out and get their input, but we'll come back to why teams both work for and against good design in another episode. We also got the idea that characters are going to have wounds, a wounds stat. Now, we said 3 in that case, and 3 kind of felt right, didn't we? We played, 3 hands? And at the end of the 3rd hand, one of us was gone and the other one was badly wounded and heavily fatigued, right on the edge. That kind of felt balanced, didn't it? That felt like it was right. But you could also have lesser characters, minions who are just people to sweep from the hero's path. They might only have 1, maybe even 2 wounds. And then you can have more serious heroes or grand villains who maybe have 4 or 5 wounds, and then big, dangerous monsters, dragons, chimeras, that kind of thing, who are going to be carrying 6 or 7 wounds. That feels like it's reasonably scalable. I could bring another human down on a roughly equal level at 3 wounds, an experienced warrior, but it's going to be much easier to bring down someone who's got fewer wounds, much harder. Just that 1 extra, 2 extra wounds, you don't have to add much more on before it's going to feel a lot harder to bring someone down. And as well as wounds, we've got fatigue. And what's fatigue going to be for? Now, we kind of brainstormed the idea that 3 fatigue could be converted into a wound. Now, I've got to ask when. At what point can I look at an enemy and go, they've got 3 fatigue, therefore they've got a wound? Do I have to have the initiative? Do I have to have hit them? Do I have to have imposed that 3rd fatigue? Is it automatic? As soon as you get 3 fatigue, they turn into a wound? I don't know. Not sure yet. Requires some playtesting. We'll think about it. But it's there, this idea that fatigue has a function. 3 fatigue becomes a wound. But what about 2 fatigue? Could 2 fatigue be used by someone? If their opponent has 2 fatigue, could they knock them down? If they've got 1 fatigue, could they shove them back? I don't know. I haven't worked it out, but I've got some ideas, and this is where it's coming over the idea of fatigue as a currency. You know, wounds are what you want to get somebody on the ground, but you can use fatigue as a currency to achieve certain advantages over your opponent, to put yourself into a tactical position. So, you know, in that hand-to-hand that we just fought, I lost, but you were carrying 2 fatigue since the first hand, really. So maybe there could be some function where I gain the initiative and now I can immediately use some of your fatigue to gain an advantage over you. I could spend your fatigue to give me an advantage. Which puts me into the thought as well that maybe you could willingly, voluntarily take on fatigue in order to gain some sort of advantage. So, you know, if I wanted to move further or faster, I could take a fatigue to add, you know, 2 inches to my movement. Or I've been knocked down, I can spend a fatigue to get back onto my feet straight away. That kind of thing is I don't know if it'll work out, but that's kind of what I'm thinking. But the other thing that came out of that experiment is the idea that you and I were engaged in combat. And I think that's going to be important, that this idea that we need to be able to move to get into combat, but how? From what angle? How quickly am I moving? Am I sneaking up into combat, stabbing you in the back, or am I charging in with my battle axe? Am I coming you face to face, or am I jumping you from behind in an ambush? That feels important, how we become engaged, but also how we become disengaged. You know, if an opponent has a substantial advantage, I've got 2 wounds, I've got 2 fatigue, but now suddenly I've been able to get the advantage. You know, I've got the initiative we talked about, I've got the initiative. Instead of attacking you, could I just cut my losses? Could I attempt to disengage and run away somehow? How would that happen? What would I need to have to make that work? I don't know. But it'll be interesting to work it through and find out. Okay, now let's talk about suits. This feels like the time, and I'll explain why. So we've got a core mechanic. The hand-to-hand resolution, it feels good. It feels okay. You know, it's not finished, it's not polished, but it feels like we've got something going on. Suits could add into that. Now, suits have got quite a long traditional history. They go right back to the beginning of playing card design that we had suits. And they've gone through various different iterations, different countries, different regions, different designs had different preferences of what the suits were. Today we've got clubs, diamonds, hearts and spades, but you may be interested to know that those 4 suits still align with some older, more traditional suits that still appear in the modern tarot. Clubs are staves or wands. Spades are swords. Diamonds are coins or pentacles. And hearts are usually cups. So we've got cups, coins, swords, and staves. Now, that, to me, reminds me of something. And we talked about Dungeons and Dragons earlier in this episode, and you know, I'm thinking wands is wizards, mages. Swords is fighters. Diamonds, coins are thieves, and hearts, cups would be clerics. So you've got the classic 4-person adventuring party of a wizard, a fighter, a thief, and a cleric. You know, that feels like something that we could tap into for a fantasy or pseudo-historical game, like an opportunity that is there to be taken. The other interesting thing about the classical suits and the suits that they're aligned with in the tarot deck is that there is a traditional association with something called the 4 humours. Now, I'm not going to remember which humour aligns to which suit, but the humours are choleric, melancholic, sanguine and phlegmatic, and they're related to ancient, discredited pseudo-medicine. The idea that the body had different balances of humours, and when they were out of balance you were somehow ill. But even though as pseudo-medicine they've stayed in our language to describe temperaments, inclinations. So a choleric person is aggressive and argumentative. A phlegmatic person is their opposite. They're more relaxed and conciliatory. A sanguine person is outgoing and fun-loving. They love parties, whereas a melancholic person is more solitary and internal. And all of those humours sit on a sort of a... You could use one of these personality nonsense tools to measure where you lie on the scale. Now, I'm not suggesting that there's necessarily any value to that in real life, but in a game, in a fictional environment, all of a sudden we've got this idea of there being almost like alignments, but alignments that are less around chaotic, good, neutral, lawful, whatever, than they are about temperament. And the idea that different characters could possess different temperaments, and when they tap into that temperament in combat, they get advantages. So a character could be aligned with spades. So if they play a spade, they get an advantage in that encounter, even if their spade isn't high. So even if a 2 isn't good, if it's of your humour, if you're aligned with that suit, you still gain some kind of advantage. I don't know how it's going to pan out. I don't know whether this is something we're going to build in. The question that we need to address, and this goes back to the principles of design, is this something I consider to be core to the game? Now, I think you'd agree with me that in terms of mechanics, it's not needed, it's not essential to the mechanics. But when we're talking about setting, when we're talking about that engaging, exciting, tactical hand-to-hand combat experience, would the addition of suits doing something like this enhance those qualities? Now, my gut is yes, they would enhance those qualities. The question is whether that enhancement is so great that it constitutes a requirement under our foundational goals. Now, I'm lucky here because I'm just writing on my own. I'm designing solo. If you're working in a team, you're going to need to take some input, get some feeling from your team. Now, I can go back to my foundational goals. I can go exciting, engaging, tactical, hand-to-hand combat. Am I happy that these mechanics are good enough without adding suits to it? Yes. Yes, I am. I might add suits, but it's non-core work. I'll focus on the core. I'll come back to suits later. Or I may go, no, it's not enough. I want more. I'm going to add suits and we're going to work on suits as part of the core design. Now, I can make that decision solo. Don't need to refer to anybody. But if you're in a team, you can't move forward on that. And it's important to say that our foundational goals aren't unmovable. If we get part way through a design and we run up against a decision like this and we go back to the foundational goals and we go, the foundational goals aren't helping. They're not sufficiently explicit or clear or expansive to help us know how to make this decision. If you're working solo, just make a decision, move on, doesn't matter. But if you're working in a team, you then need to get the team in. You need to canvass some opinions, you need to get some ideas, you need to get some feedback, and you need to work on those foundational goals, bulk them out, add them up. So when you're saying exciting, engaging, tactical hand-to-hand combat, you're going to say, what proportion of a play experience is that going to represent? Is it going to be 10%, 20%, 50%, more? And how complex? Do we want it to be really quite challenging? Do we want each encounter to be a real mental effort of decision making of, oh, do I play my king of diamonds or my 2 of spades? Because my king of diamonds will beat them, but it's not aligned with my suit. But if I play the 2 of spades, I'll lose and I'll take damage, but I'll gain the advantage of my suit. Do you want there to be more complex decision making to be made as a fundamental part of the game? Or do you want to make that kind of more optional? Which way you go is entirely up to you. There is no right answer. But that's one of the ways in which working with a team versus working solo is different. And we mentioned earlier about other examples where working within a team that you can bounce ideas off is great. Working solo, sometimes you've just got to rely on your own gut feeling being adequate. So it cuts both ways. So we're nearly at the end here. Let's review how far we've got. So we've got a reasonable core mechanic, but that core mechanic is going to inform us of where the design needs to go, because the core mechanic isn't going to do everything, especially when it's just a random outcome generator. So we've still got a lot of stuff to add. We've got to think about things like the number of cards. I mean, I just played out 5. Is that right? Is that not enough? Is that too many? We could go down to 3, up to 7. I feel like, given the mechanic that we've got, 2 cards or fewer is going to be too few, but 3 could work. Maybe different characters are going to have different numbers of cards, but if you've got different numbers of cards, how do you deal with circumstances where one person's got cards left and the other hasn't? You're taking away opportunities for people to score wounds, but is it fair to leave somebody defenseless because they've run out of cards? Not sure. Maybe we'll have a fixed number of cards. Then we've got number of wounds. I talked about it earlier. It's something we're going to think about, what the range of wounds could be and where it's going to sit. Is it going to be part of a stat line? Is it going to be a quality that's inherent to particular kinds of characters? So humans are always wounds 3, or heroes are wounds 3 and minions are wounds 2, lords are wounds 4, that kind of thing. Don't know yet, but we'll think about that. Something I've not yet talked about is armour. And just brainstorming off camera how armour might work. And something I've talked about in my podcast in the past is how frustrated I feel when armour is just used as a way of negating a hit. You know, if you've ever worn armour and been hit with something, you'll know that armour doesn't just negate a hit. Even if it completely eliminates the damage, there's still the shock and the impact of being struck. And that applies as much to a tank as it does to a knight in armour. So my feeling is that armour can eliminate wounds, but not by wiping them out, rather it would turn them into fatigue. And you can have different grades of armour. So for example, a light armour would turn a wounding hit from a jack into fatigue. Medium armour would turn a wounding hit from a queen or a jack into fatigue, whereas heavy armour might turn a wounding hit from a king, queen or jack into fatigue. Now I did wonder, and I haven't play tested it at all yet, so I did wonder if that might be game breaking, but it did occur to me that we've still got aces and jokers, and we'll come to jokers in a second, which could cause wounds, and then we've also got fatigue. We talked about 3 fatigue cause a wound, so it doesn't make you immune to wounds. So I like the shape of the idea. We'll have to play it out and see how game-breaking it is, but I like the shape of the idea that heavy armour converts a lot of wounds into fatigue, but you're taking more fatigue because you're carrying the heavy armour, and therefore that fatigue is more likely to end up in wounds. I like that. That feels like a good idea. Jokers. Now we didn't get any jokers turn up in our hands, in the hands that we played, but I did have an idea about jokers. Broadly speaking, my initial fundamental plan for core rules on jokers is that a joker is either an unblockable attack or an unbreakable block. So you can always play a joker to block any attack, you can always play a joker to break through any block. The only exception is jokers block jokers. Yeah. And that's it for jokers, but there's room for them to do more. You know, the fact that we've got a red joker and a black joker in the vast majority of decks is something to work with. I haven't decided yet what it's going to be. We'll play test it through. I'm open to suggestions, but you know, it's there. We acknowledge that joker's there. We've got an idea for them in the core rules. We can play it through. And then the last thing I'm thinking that I need to take away and think about is skill levels. So if it feels like we're going to have a fixed number of cards for combat, regardless of how good someone is, feels like we have the option to have skill levels in there where you can swap cards. So you might deal yourself a hand of cards, you don't like what you get, if your skill level is 1, 2 or 3, that's how many cards you can discard and take new cards into your hand. So I might draw 5 cards and go, oh my, this is dreadful. I've got 2 2s, a 5 and 2 8s. It's not a great hand. So I'm going to discard, let's say I've got a skill level of 3 on this character, I'm going to discard the 2 2s and the 5, and I'm going to take 3 new cards. And off that, I've got a 4, a 7 and a jack. Still not great, but it's better than a poke in the eye with a sharp stick. So it's an idea that I kind of like. It leaps out to me as something that'll work, but where's that skill level going to sit? Is it going to be a stat on a character, or is it going to be something inherent to a particular character class? I don't know yet. We're going to work that out. So that's it for my core mechanic. Everything's going to be built and revolve around this mechanic, but there are still those peripheral core ideas, particularly movement, how we engage, that's going to dictate how the game works. And those are going to be core as well, because the game won't work without them, but they're going to be dictated by the core. We're going to look at the peripheral core mechanics next week. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you'll join us in the next episode, and I'll speak to you then. If you enjoyed this content, please consider supporting Precinct Omega via Patreon for behind-the-scenes, early access and exclusive extra videos and vlogs, or help keep the show on the road and get great new games from Precinct Omega at wargame.com.